Ken Sigel will give the next presentation on Secure Governance in the Cloud. Ken Sigel is the Director of Systems Engineering for HITRUST, a cloud security automation company. HITRUST provides virtual appliance solutions as an essential foundation for cloud control, visibility, data security, management, and compliance.
Hi, this is Ken Sigel, Director of Systems Engineering at HITRUST. Today I'm going to talk about secure governance in the cloud. First point I'd like to make is around the fact that you really can't tell the good guys from the bad guys in the infrastructure. Oftentimes you have your trusted insiders, your trusted administrators managing the infrastructure, making mistakes, taking down the infrastructure. You also have malicious administrators, maybe just disgruntled, that are taking down the infrastructure because they're unhappy about their situation. And you also have breaches where you have these malicious outsiders attacking the infrastructure and getting access to sometimes credentials for the infrastructure, or hacking their way into the infrastructure and getting access to an exposed part of the data center where they can manage and get access to your data. In all of these cases, you really can't tell who's who. You can see the administrative activity happening in a limited way, and you really can't see the operations happening in real time. And you need to ensure that you do have some control so you can prevent some of these breaches that we've been hearing about. Everyone's heard about Target, especially getting hacked into by someone getting the access to the administrator controls, the administrator credentials. And that's not really where it stops, is you have to make sure that you have controls in place. Once the administrators are in, you're able to protect from the environment from what those administrators are doing. Here's an example of a traditional data center. You have your applications tied to the physical hardware for compute, network, and storage devices. And the difference with virtualization is now you're introducing a concept of pooled resources. You have your compute, network, and storage, but in order to run your applications and on top of that physical part of the infrastructure, now you have a virtualization management plane that's been introduced where you have virtualization administrators managing the infrastructure. They have access to, in many cases, all of the parts of the infrastructure without a lot of separation of duties or segregation of the infrastructure based on the types of resources. And that really opens up a gap for security and compliance where these administrators have excessive privileges, you can't see what they're doing, and there really aren't the data security policies or protections that need to be in place to make sure your data is not leaking outside of the infrastructure. So in terms of managing the gap, here are some examples of actual administrative activities. With excessive privileges assigned to a virtualization infrastructure administrator, the VI admin can move a virtual machine from a regulated part of the infrastructure to an unregulated physical part of the infrastructure. And you need to make sure that you have policy-based controls that transparently govern the actions of the VI admins. That means that the controls actually understand the context of all of the objects in the infrastructure. So if you have an administrator operating within the regulated part of the infrastructure, they're only managing those resources in the regulated part of the infrastructure. And if the administrators managing some of the test dev part of the infrastructure that maybe is not regulated, that those systems are completely segregated from your regulated workloads to make sure that there's no data leaking between them. I've also heard this around the DMZ part of an environment. You want to make sure that you're protecting the DMZ so that regulated workloads are not getting out on the DMZ where they shouldn't be, or any access to a DMZ is not getting into your production or your internal systems that have some of your intellectual property. Lack of visibility, this is really just around good security, good compliance controls. Any attempts to configure the infrastructure, whether they're unsuccessful or successful attempts to actually make changes by connecting a virtual machine that should be connected to a regulated workload or regulated network, If it gets connected to an unregulated network, there's really no audit trail or sufficient audit trail to see who actually made the change, where they came from, what they were trying to do. And you need to make sure that you have a security proxy in place to be able to capture an audit trail that contains all of the fine-grained details of your log records that can be passed over to your SIM tool to be able to analyze the behavior of your administrators. The absence of data security in the infrastructure, this just means that if your virtual machines, your applications now are not encrypted, they can leave the infrastructure and be powered on and accessed by someone who shouldn't have access to your virtual machines. This also is very important if you're running into a public cloud infrastructure like Amazon, Microsoft Azure, others, where your virtual machines actually are now running in this public cloud infrastructure, and often due to SLAs, those infrastructures are making backup copies of your virtual machines. You need to make sure that you have those virtual machines encrypted, so you always maintain the encryption keys, and at any point, if you wanted to revoke access to use those keys, all of your virtual machines in the infrastructure associated with that specific key would not be able to be accessed. So the virtual machine would not be able to be decrypted. And often, companies are relying on whole disk encryption. That only protects you as long as the files are maintained on that physical disk. Once the files are copied off of that physical disk, they're no longer going to be encrypted and they'll be exposed. So you need to make sure that the encryption that you have is block level encryption in the guest operating system, so the crypto always travels with the VM, whether it's in the private or a public cloud. A couple real-world examples of where there have been issues associated with virtualization. One is Shinogi. This is a case where an administrator, obviously trusted administrator initially, hired by the company to manage all of their infrastructure. However, after being disgruntled and for whatever reason was laid off, the administrator hatched a plan to get back into the infrastructure by leaving a bunch of backdoor accounts open and access to the infrastructure. Was able to log in through the VPN from a local McDonald's Wi-Fi, went into their production servers, their virtual machines, powered them off and deleted 88 of their virtual machines, taking down the entire company for several days, causing nearly $1 million worth of damage. That administrator actually ended up serving almost 2 years in jail and had to pay back in the damages caused by that administrator. So definitely the disgruntled employee, or initially trusted, but then for whatever reason, those trusted insiders are definitely a threat by either maliciously causing some damage in the infrastructure, or often it's inadvertently causing some damage to the infrastructure. So you need to make sure that in either case, you have role-based access controls over all of the virtual administrative actions, and you also can add additional controls such as secondary approval or two-person rules, so that you could have some manager or peer review for any of those critical functions on the most critical workloads. Another example is that virtual machines actually can be copied outside of the infrastructure very easily by a virtualization administrator. Virtual machines in the infrastructure are just files that could be copied either to a laptop and walked out the building, or copied to a USB stick. And because they're so portable, you need to ensure that you have some controls in place. One control is that you would not allow someone to actually copy the data files out of the virtual infrastructure, but then your storage administrator can go right directly into the storage and copy files out of it. So in order to prevent those virtual machines from being walked outside your infrastructure, you need to make sure that, again, you've got the block level encryption for the virtual machine, and key management should be retained on premise by whoever owns that data. So if you have certain business units that are managing those virtual machines, they would have access to their keys to manage their virtual machines. And so it's multi-tenant aware, or needs to be multi-tenant aware, to make sure that whoever is managing those keys should only be managing keys to their own virtual machines. So it's obviously been in the media for the last couple of years pretty extensively. Almost every day there's another breach or a couple of breaches that happen that are announced in the media. Target, I think, kicked things off on the commercial side. Edward Snowden kicked things off on the federal side to get the attention that security is a problem for everyone. All of these companies definitely have security plans in place and procedures in place, yet there are still breaches happening, and it's really just that you need to be aware of where the security controls need to be placed. You have a lot of tools that address the security controls for the existing layers where there have been these historic security controls in place. So host hardening, files, an actual physically locked data center, antivirus for the application layer, patch management. These are tools that have existed for a long time. And with virtualization, you also need to ensure that you do have a secure virtualization proxy or an application-based firewall to manage all of the access to the infrastructure, to be able to put the granular controls and policy controls in place. And you also need to make sure that you're encrypting those virtual machines so that they're not able to be taken outside of the infrastructure or spun up where they shouldn't be. So in terms of summarizing what HITRUST does for the infrastructure, we're delivering solutions that enable policy-driven security, enabling availability and compliance for the enterprise. So in terms of a private or public cloud, we want to make sure that we're putting the proper controls in place, and we're also making sure that you maintain ownership of your data wherever it resides, and you can always ensure that your data is not able to be used outside of the boundaries of your data center. So thanks for watching. Again, if you have any questions, you can email us at sales@hitrust.com or look us up at www.hitrust.com.